Are you supplementing vitamin D as part of your daily protocol? Maybe you're wondering, is this even really necessary? And how much should I even be supplementing? Well, what we're going to do today is actually take a different look. We're not going to directly answer those questions, especially not from the perspective of supplementation. We're actually going to look at these from the perspective of food and talk about how to reduce your need for vitamin D supplementation with eggs. And I'll make a few comments about a few other foods in there as well. But we're going to talk mostly about eggs. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill out at Harvest Hills Ranch. And as I was doing some research recently and looking at various nutritional aspects of eggs and actually focusing more on the protein component, I noticed that there were several studies that were popping up that were making reference to vitamin D in eggs, which is a logical conclusion just because there's such a significant fat component to eggs. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble nutrient. Makes sense that you would find that in that food source, but is it a significant enough contribution that it actually makes some type of significant impact on our vitamin D levels? And how does it compare to other foods in the diet as well? I'm going to try to give some insight on that today. And to really understand the nature of this conversation, we have to look at this first through the need of vitamin D. And what is the adequacy of vitamin D for the average individual? And maybe that's better stated as there's a huge inadequacy for vitamin D. We probably in the last decade and a half, we've recognized that the amount of vitamin D that was being recognized as a recommended daily allowance was pretty inferior. It just didn't meet the requirements and certainly didn't meet the need for optimization. What does that actually look like? Well, most people now are looking at this through blood, and if you're hovering in that range above 30, anywhere from say 30 to around 50, that's still not meeting your metabolic needs. That's still not allowing for optimization of many metabolic processes in the body. When you really start to get into more of an optimal level, we think more in the range of 50 to 60 certainly, and even really up around 75 plus in some cases, depending on what the nature of the health of that individual's health is. But if you're trying to look at maintaining things like bone mineralization and optimization of muscle function, a level of 50 to 60 is really what's going to be the ideal level to be able to maintain those things. Now, certainly, again, you can go higher with that. But the question is, well, why do we have so much of a demand for vitamin D, and why are we so inadequate in it? And there's a lot of reasons that could be associated with this. Some of these you've probably more than heard. We tend to be indoors a lot today in today's current day and age. So being indoors, not having an adequate sunlight exposure, even when you're in locations that you would think would have a high amount of vitamin D, that you would have a high amount of vitamin D production in some of the southern latitudes, that doesn't necessarily contribute to vitamin D production year-round. So, for example, I live in Texas, southeast Texas, and even in the winter months here, we don't have enough sun exposure to really drive adequate vitamin D production. And just to go ahead and drip this point, that same concept applies for not just humans, but animals too. So I'll speak more to that as we continue on, but sunlight exposure makes a difference in their vitamin D concentrations as well. So we need to think about that. Of course, there's things like sunscreen exposure, but one of the things that I run into certainly a lot with patients is the fact that the demand for vitamin D is high because of various metabolic dysfunction. Most individuals at the time I do initial testing are going to have a vitamin D deficiency, but when you start factoring in conditions, metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, blood sugar handling problems, autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative conditions. I mean, it's a pretty long list to where vitamin D is associated with. And the worse those states of dysfunction, generally the higher demand for vitamin D is going to be. We've seen that in recent years with all the attention towards immune function, but notably the point here is that as the immune function decline and as the immune function demands increased, the need for vitamin D was even that much higher as well. So we saw a lot of individuals advocating for supplementation of vitamin D. Well, that brings us back to the question of what can we do in addition to supplementation? And there's a time and a place for supplementation. So I want to make that clear. And in fact, when we talk about being able to pull someone out of a deficiency state in general, supplementation has to be a consideration on that. But with a long-term perspective in mind and looking at things that we can do through the diet to help achieve those optimal levels of vitamin D faster and even be able to maintain those levels of vitamin D without supplementation, what are some foods that we should be looking at with that? And I'm going to position eggs at the top of the list for this conversation, but I will tell you that there are some foods that are higher. For example, fish, different types of fish. So I probably shouldn't lump all fish in the same category here because there is quite a bit of difference in different fish. But for the purpose of what I have knowledge and expertise in, I'm going to stick with terrestrial animals for the nature of this conversation. And eggs, again, are very high on the list. Now, what I wanted to do is, again, I want to reiterate why they're high. And then I want to show you some evidence where not only is it that eggs are high in vitamin D and they're a good source of vitamin D from terrestrial animals, from land-based animals, but they also positively affect other nutrients as well. And that doesn't appear to be just as a byproduct of delivering that nutrient. It also appears to be just from the standpoint of how eggs are being utilized. There appear to be other mechanisms that are not just straight delivery by which it increases other nutrients. And maybe that's better uptake through foods that are consumed at the same time. That's not 100% clear at this point, but it does speak to the significance of eggs in the diet and what a contributor that they can be. All of that being said, let's do this. I want to share a few points with you here, and then I want to look at handling of eggs and how does that affect vitamin D status, because I think these are some things that you need to know, and I'd imagine that these are questions that are probably going to come up. So let me point to a few things here as it relates to eggs, and let me talk about that storage and the cooking and the handling here for a moment. And you can see that when we look at nutrients, we have to think about the impact that different handling methods can have on those nutrients. So for example, we cook a food, we heat it up, and it could potentially denature some nutrients in there. So what does that look like in the arena of vitamin D? Well, in this case, vitamin D is actually, in eggs specifically, is affected very little with heating the food or with cooking. Even when you look at the difference between a raw egg and a boiled egg, and some of these are, for example, where eggs were boiled up to 10 minutes. You know, I know when we boil eggs here at home, we boil those for about 7 minutes. So we would anticipate that there'd probably be a little bit less than what I'm getting ready to tell you, but you only denature the vitamin D by about 6 to 10%, 6 to 11%, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it's not a significant reduction in vitamin D that we see when we look at when we look at the effects of cooking. What tends to be the damaging effect to vitamin D really is light. You have three components that are of potential detriment to vitamin D. You have heat, you have oxygen, you have light. And oxygen and heat don't seem to be big damaging factors, but light seems to be more of a detriment to vitamin D. Now, if we look at that and we start to expand beyond, we know that eggs can be a good source of vitamin D. When we look at the impact of preparing foods, eggs specifically, with vitamin D, doesn't have a huge detriment on that. So what are some of the other things that we can look at here in regards to how vitamin D and how eggs as a whole can affect other nutrients? And I find it interesting that we can often talk about that there is a shortfall in some nutrient status and that we can use eggs to overcome some of those shortfalls. So specifically, what are some of the shortfalls in the diet that we can look at? And we know nutrient deficiencies. Maybe I shouldn't say we know. Maybe what I should say on this is that from my experience and observation of looking at nutrient assessment testing with individuals, nutrient deficiencies are rampant. They're pretty prevalent. But when you look at the difference between individuals that consume eggs and don't consume eggs, and for those of us that consume eggs, we just don't really think about not consuming eggs. But granted that there are individuals that have concerns around egg consumption because they're worried about the impact that that's going to have on their cholesterol levels. They're worried about the impact that that's going to have on raising their saturated fat intake, and what's that going to do as a cardiovascular risk. That's a topic for another day, but I can summarize in saying that those risks aren't justified. So when you look at the egg consumer versus the non-egg consumer, we see that typically higher dietary fiber, higher calcium, higher magnesium, higher potassium, total choline, which is a nutrient that certainly falls in short supply, vitamin A, C, D, E. You'll find that all of those nutrients are typically more available for individuals that are egg consumers, simply because they have consumed those foods naturally, or let me state that differently, those foods are naturally found in eggs. So it would make sense that as they consume those foods, naturally there's going to be more availability to increase that status of those nutrients. And I find it interesting also that it's not just the fat soluble nutrients that are mentioned there, or even the fat soluble metabolites like choline. We also see that several minerals come into play. And the one that's always interesting there to me is potassium, because a lot of times in the standard American diet and the Western diet, we have an abundance of consumption of sodium just because of the way that foods are handled and prepared, and the preservation process of foods that sit for extended periods of time. And we have to balance that with potassium. Our inherent intake of potassium should be much higher, so we can look at these natural sources like eggs as also being a delivery mechanism for potassium as well. Now, let's look at some other information here, and you'll see potential of egg as complementary food to improve nutrient intake and diversity, dietary diversity. And so when we look at this, we can see that dietary intake of cholesterol and vitamin D was higher. Again, this is in the intervention group versus the control group. And there was a lower intake of B3 and B6 in the egg group. But nutrients like niacin and B6 can be picked up from other sources, but certainly cholesterol looked at as an optimal dietary source here, or something we need in the diet. And then also vitamin D again being pointed out. And this was also interesting because one side note that I want to bring forth that came out in this particular information is that you'll notice it says no babies developed egg allergy or sensitization, and this was as a result of routine egg consumption, right? So the point here being is that frequency of egg consumption doesn't necessarily dictate the incidence or duration of allergy-related symptoms. There's more to it than that. So eggs shouldn't be something, especially when related to some of the sourcing that I'm going to speak to here momentarily, eggs should not be something that we look at as something to be avoided because they've been labeled as an allergen. We really have to make that more of an individual type of conversation. And when you look at on a cost basis, it's pretty doggone hard to beat eggs in terms of the value that they deliver in terms of nutrients, especially nutrients that are typically not adequately consumed in the diet. This study points out things like choline, vitamin A, vitamin D as being inadequately supplied in the American diet. But eggs are a very cheap protein source. They're a very cheap source of these nutrients, and these are highly bioavailable sources on these nutrients. So I think that's important to point out to this conversation as well. Now, is this entire conversation around eggs? Let me add this in because I think this is a good point to interject this, and then I'm going to come back to the eggs. But when you look at other sources of vitamin D, the natural vitamin D content in animal products is higher than what you find in plant products. And again, sticking with this conversation around vitamin D, one of the things that I'll point us to here is if you look at this particular data, and you can go back and look over this, if you're looking outside of eggs, pretty much all animal products are going to have some concentration of vitamin D in them. They have vitamin D in what some would call its inactive or unhydroxylated form. And then you also have the hydroxylated form, which is the 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Both of those forms occur in these animal sources, and that's a fairly consistent theme throughout. But things like your organ meats, you'll often hear these talked about as offals. The liver, the kidney are generally deemed across the board as in beef, in pork, in lamb, and your ruminant animals. Those are generally deemed to be the higher sources of vitamin D. But let me come on down to where we start to look at eggs, and notice on this that eggs are appreciable levels of both vitamin D, again in its non-hydroxylated form, but also in your 25-hydroxy form of vitamin D. And both of those forms are going to be necessary because ultimately you're going to continue to take these, whether you're going next to the liver with the unhydroxylated form or whether you move on and you hydroxylate it again in the kidney. Those are ultimately going to be your most impactful, physiologically active forms of vitamin D. But the point being is that both forms reside in eggs as well as other animal products. Now, there's one side point in here, just to make complete in terms of sourcing on this from these terrestrial animals. I found it interesting when I looked at dairy, and this truly probably does deserve its own video, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to interject this here as an interesting point. When it comes to dairy, your butter is a great source on that. So typically when you look at things like your higher fat concentration dairy sources, they are going to be higher in vitamin D. But then also it's interesting when you do a comparison of raw milk versus a pasteurized milk, the raw milk shows a higher maintenance of vitamin D. And I also think that this is worth noting when you start talking about if you're sourcing your milk from a local farm based on the kind of animals that they have, that's going to, the breed of animals is what I'm referring to here, that's also going to affect the vitamin D. So for example, if a farmer has a Jersey cow versus a Holstein cow, that Jersey cow typically has a higher butter fat compared to the Holstein. And so all those factors play into ultimately how much vitamin D is going to be provided there. Now, all of that being said, there's quite a bit of opportunity when you look at these eggs to optimize the intake of vitamin D. But again, as you're listening to this and thinking, okay, I need to get more eggs into my diet, hit the pause button for just a second and allow me to add one additional point to this conversation that I think is worth considering, thinking about, doing a bit of research on for yourself and for your family, because this is something with regards to the diet that you need to understand as it relates to sourcing. So you can see here that free-range farming, a natural alternative to produce vitamin D-rich eggs. And this goes back to the comment I made earlier, where when you look at the activity of the animal, meaning that animal being outside, and if you compare this to a conventional model, so we know that in the conventional model, egg laying is typically occurs indoors, whereas when you look at the free range model, those animals are raised outdoors, they have exposure to sunlight, and you actually see this with the combs on the birds, that those combs, as long as they have adequate sunlight exposure, they have a very rich red appearance to them, and that's a good indication just in regards to the health of the animal, but it also speaks to the nutritional quality indirectly, but it does speak to it because of information like this, to the nutritional quality that's going to be in that product, in this case in the egg. So we would anticipate that these free range animals have greater sunlight exposure. The sunlight exposure through the UVB radiation is going to increase cholesterol increase vitamin D production from cholesterol, and that vitamin D production accumulates, the vitamin D accumulates in the eggs, because remember guys, you want And it is natural to have an accumulation of these nutrients in an egg, because if you recall what an egg is a single cell that has the abilities to sustain a life enough to the degree that a chick can develop. And so you're literally going from a single cell with all these nutrients to a living chick, to a living bird, right? And so it just speaks to the culmination of all these nutrients being associated in that one entity. And then as the human, you make that a part of your diet, then that is a natural continual flow of those nutrients into you as well. So logical deduction, right? Nothing light bulb, no light bulb moment associated with that, but it does matter where that food comes from, and it does matter the quantity of that food. And I think we have to look at these points because we have to look at this from the standpoint of these are the nutrients that you require in your diet. And if you go back and you look at the conversation around eggs over the last 20 years, it's been a flip-flop of a conversation. Eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you, and there's been different reasons on both sides, and it continues to go back and forth. But it becomes very difficult to argue for the harm around an egg when you look at that egg being a complete source of nutrition, when you look at that egg being able to supply nutrients that are typically not adequately consumed from other sources in the diet. And it also makes a good argument for why animal products, so not just eggs, but other animal products and other sources of animal fats, why they are such valuable importance into our dietary intake. Now, I want to close this out with a little bit of conjecture here about supplementation and food intake on this. And this doesn't need to be a conversation of either or. And frankly, you know, if I've got someone who is coming into me, and this is definitely not unheard of, this happens more than it definitely should, but if I've got someone coming in who has a vitamin D in the 20s or low 30s, which is, again, it's very common, I need that individual to be on supplementation. I need that individual to be taking 5,000 to 10,000 units of vitamin D a day. And just as a side note on that, there has been a change in the way that vitamin D is reported on labels. So you will still see IUs, but you're also going to see micrograms. So 125 to 250 micrograms would be consistent. So 1 microgram is going to be 40 IUs. But point being on this is that they need a higher supplemental dose for a period of time. But remember, the end goal here is that we want to build a dietary pattern that is rich in a consistent supply of those nutrients. And if we can do that, then ultimately over time, we can prevent the regression back into a deficiency state. And that's really the important part of this conversation. However you get out of that deficiency state, just get out of it. But let's talk about maintaining your health and keeping you there, and the inclusion of eggs as a rich source of a rich nutrient source in the diet becomes extremely important. And for those of you that are listening to this that are thinking, I can't eat chicken eggs, and you're only thinking in the context of chicken eggs, don't eliminate other egg sources. Think in regards to duck eggs. Think in regards to, a goose egg or a turkey egg. Duck eggs are certainly the most, or certainly the second easiest to find on that list. But don't overlook eggs just because chicken eggs aren't an option for you. Look out for some of those alternative egg sources as well. So I hope you found this enlightening. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you start to think about when you're eating eggs that those are a good source of vitamin D for you. They're a good adjunct in your diet, and it's a way that you can help maintain your levels over the long term and help them rebound faster if you're already in a deficiency state. So hey, if you like the information, make sure that you go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. I'm going to continue to bring you content of how to optimize your health and talk about how the farm products that we produce out here at Harvest Hills Ranch, how they actually help build and promote health, and maybe give you a different perspective on those foods as you consume them. So until next time, guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I will talk to you soon.